Behind the gates of Fox Hollow Farms, mannequins stood as silent witnesses to Herb Baumeister's double life. Was he one killer or two? Was he both I-70 Strangler and the man who buried victims on his estate? For more than a decade, no gay man in Indianapolis was safe. But how did this walking creepazoid manage to not attract attention? Herb was kooky, dark, and downright frightening. He didn't hide his quirks and obsessions at all. This is Evidence Obscured, the place where no case is off limits, where no detail is too disturbing, and where we don't shy away from the truth, no matter how hideous the answers are. So hop on. This train's heading off to meet a real-life devil, and his name was Herbert Richard Baumeister. Let's get into it. Since this case involves two separate serial killings that are almost certainly the work of one single man, I should start with the suspect himself to keep everything in an orderly timeline and therefore coherent. Remember when I said that Herb Baumeister was a creepazoid? Yeah, I wasn't saying that lightly. This odd little cretin was a walking red flag since before he even went to school. He had an obsession with urine, often chasing his little neighborhood friends around the yard, begging for them to give him their pee so he could taste it. Oh, I'm not joking, and it gets worse. He urinated on one teacher's desk and placed a dead crow on another's. You must be wondering why the school, his family, and friends didn't report any of this disturbing behavior. Well, Herbie was a funny little chap. His wild and dark sense of humor made it hard to discern whether or not his pranks and comments were done because he was disturbed or if it was because he was an eccentric comedian with a dark sense of humor. He must have played the part well, because he was not singled out by his peers, he wasn't bullied, and he wasn't an outcast. His father, a respected anesthesiologist, could be sharp with his 4 children and even smacked Herb over the head on occasion. But in the 60s, this wasn't hardly considered abuse. Herbie was odd and a little disturbing, but he played it off so well as dark humor that no one thought to intervene. All except for one person, his father, Herb Sr. He took his son in for an evaluation when Herb was in his preteens, and the doctor came back with a rather alarming diagnosis: paranoid schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder, with a possible multiple personality disorder on top of that. Schizophrenia almost always has a genetic component, but multiple personality disorder, now that's a whole different can of worms. MPD has only ever been documented in individuals that suffered extreme trauma in their early childhoods, usually related to sexual abuse, resulting in a fracturing that makes the brain create separate personalities that act on their own accord, each preserving the traumatic memories so that the main host does not have to recall it. Whatever the case, dark and demented little Herb went on to grow up in Indianapolis, much to the bemused confusion of his friends and his father's refusal to have his oldest son receive any further treatment for his suspected psychiatric conditions. But as far as any documented history goes, Herb never suffered any extreme trauma that we know of. But if that diagnosis was accurate, then it's all but certain that he did. On a brighter note, Herb was academically inclined and took part in every knowledge-based extracurricular activity that he could find. He enrolled in Indiana University in 1964 and dropped out after just 1 semester. He returned in '65, but dropped out again after just 1 semester. That's also where he met his future wife, Julie Sater. Like everyone else, Julie thought Herb was funny, smart, and quite likable. He worked a few odd jobs while his new fiancée finished her studies, and all of his colleagues reported that he was unusual, odd even, but so eccentric that they considered him more funny than alarming. One of his bosses reported that someone had broken into his office to urinate on his desk on multiple occasions. Wonder who'd have done something like that, huh? Julie and Herb got married, and that marriage was just as unusual as everything else about the man that wore the Joker's smile with such ease. Throughout their marriage, they only had sex 6 times, resulting in 3 children. It seems that the only time Herb was ever intimate with his spouse was for the purposes of reproduction. But Julie accepted this without complaint. She loved her strange husband, who seemed to have his head in the clouds all the time, had that dark sense of humor, despite his many dead-end jobs. Just 6 months after they said their I do's, Julie begged her father-in-law to have Herb professionally seen. For months, Herb would return from work only to sit on the couch crying for hours. He would scream and shout at his colleagues, the first ever sign of any outward violence from him. Whatever treatment Herb received at the hospital, it seemed to do the trick. He was out in just 2 months and even attempted to go to university again, only to repeat the process of dropping out after a single semester. Julie never brought up the institutionalization again, going back to being the dutiful wife that was about to give birth to their first child.
The Indiana Department of Transportation maintains over 11,000 miles of roadway, and we paint those miles of roadway each year, and this is just an isolated incident that happened.
The drive-by striping, whatever.
Herb Baumeister of Carmel saw it all.
I said to my son, they're gonna hit that raccoon with the spray gun, and sure enough, they just striped right over its face and neck. Didn't even move it, no effort to, get it out of the way. So I happened to have a Polaroid with me, so I took a shot at the thing.
A raccoon, which met its demise on the yellow line, became one with the paint. The raccoon has since been removed. This is all that's left.
This was just, the painter should have had a chalk line drawn around his career by state officials. There was no excuse for that. The poor thing deserved a better fate than that.
So just what is the explanation for this? For that, we went to the State Highway Department itself.
The Indiana Department of Transportation feels like this is irregular.
This hospitalization makes many question how much Herb Sr. knew or suspected of his son's conditions. The institution was not for minor care. That place was for serious, untreatable conditions. So Herb's father probably knew that there was a lot more wrong with his son than he was willing to accept publicly. Why else would he have chosen to put Herb there of all places? It's sometime after this stint that Herb began to secretly frequent gay bars in the city, and a series of killings started to take place in June 1980. The killer, dubbed the I-70 Strangler, murdered a dozen men and boys. All of them disappeared from the same gay bars that Herb was hanging out at. Most of their bodies were found strangled and dumped on Interstate 70. First, as Michael Petrie, a 15-year-old child prostitute who was found naked and strangled to death. 2 years later, 22-year-old Maurice Allen Taylor, another sex worker. In October of '82, 14-year-old Delvoyd Lee Baker was found strangled in a river. Like Michael, Delvoyd was also offering sexual services at gay bars. Delvoyd is seen getting into a dark van or station wagon, possibly blue or gray, being driven by a skinny man with a mustache. This was the only year that Herb ever grew out a mustache, and yes, he drove a dark blue 1980s Buick station wagon. On May the 28th, 1983, 22-year-old Michael Andrew Riley vanished from a Vogue theater and was later found strangled. A witness claimed that Michael got into a dark station wagon with a tall, brown-haired man. In the background, Herb was still freaking out his co-workers with his off-brand humor, which included peeing on his boss's desk again. On May 7, 1985, 17-year-old Eric Allen Rodker vanished. Unlike the others, Eric was not openly gay, so it's thought that he moonlighted as a sex worker in secret too. Eric was also strangled, and he had an unusual burn mark on his shoulder, indicating that the killer was starting to experiment. This is an important factor to consider. If I was Herb committing the murders, and I believe he was, then that shows us that he's capable of changing his MO if he needs to. A year later, the body of 29-year-old Michael Allen Glenn appeared. And another year after that, 21-year-old James Boyd Robbins Jr. In 1988, there were no more confirmed deaths that could be tied to the I-70 Strangler. So why the sudden halt in activity? Let's just say that Herb had a lot going on in his life. That was the year that his father died, and the year that he took a loan from his mother to open his own business, a thrift store that he named Save-A-Lot. The store was so profitable that he opened several more Save-A-Lots, successfully founding a chain store. He was doing financially well, so much so that he bought an estate for $1 million in Westfield, Indiana, called Fox Hollow Farm. 18 acres that housed an 11,000 square foot mansion with an indoor pool, horse barn, and a massive garage and basement. Not to mention the convenient patch of woods on the property and being several miles away from the prying eyes of neighbors.
An 18-acre estate in Westfield, Indiana, just north of Indianapolis. The Tudor style home was built in 1979 and features 5 bedrooms and an indoor swimming pool. It is most famous for being the home of suspected serial killer Herb Baumeister. The owner gave us a tour of the home and stated that he had not had any experiences in the home in the 10 years he has resided there. He stated that some of the evidence we may have seen on TV or read on the internet was staged. He allows investigators into his home 5 times a year simply because people are curious. He pointed out areas where others have claimed to have caught EVPs or seen apparitions. He also pointed out the areas on the property where bodies were apparently burned and disposed of. He allowed us access to all areas of the home and grounds. We conducted EVP sessions in nearly every room of the home and in the areas on the grounds where bones were discovered. No EVPs were captured. We did have some K2 activity on the side of the 5-car garage where bones were discovered under a compost pile. It appeared that something was communicating with us as the K2 lit up in response to questions we asked. That activity was not caught on camera. We also had some K2 activity in the woods where the so-called burn pit was located. It was fairly steady, but did not seem to be in response to any questions. While no apparent electrical lines or other indication of possible interference was noted, it was just too random.
Julie threw herself into the kids' activities, church, and charitable events, not to mention a fair amount of traveling, while Herb stayed behind to take care of the businesses. The next year, in 1990, the I-70 Strangler surfaced one last time. He killed Clay Russell Boatman and Thomas Ray Clevenger Jr., and in 1991, he killed his final victim, Otto Gary Becker, before disappearing into thin air. Police never had a suspect, but they did have a perfect handprint and a semen sample from 2 of the crime scenes, and the description of a dark van that had a thin man behind the wheel that sometimes wore a mustache. But that didn't mean that the problem was gone. Sure, no bodies were showing up in ditches anymore, but the same amount of men were still going missing. It's thought that Herb was the one killing men and boys in Indianapolis all along, but once he settled into the estate and his wife and kids were away for summer vacations by the lake, then it would make sense that he'd move his depraved pastime to a more secure location where he could take time with his victims. First to go missing in '93 was 23-year-old John Lee Baer. His abandoned car was found at a park frequented by male sex workers. 2 months later, Jeffrey Allen Jones disappeared. Richard Douglas Hamilton Jr. came next. He wasn't even reported as missing by his family. Instead, a warrant was issued by police because he'd missed a court date, and everyone just assumed that Richard skipped town to avoid getting prosecuted for prostitution or drug charges. On August the 6th, 2 men disappeared on the same evening. 27-year-old Alan Lee Livingston and Manuel Resendez, age 34. Manuel went missing right from inside a club he was at with his friends, while Alan was last seen getting into a dark blue or gray car outside another club. There is a possibility that they went missing a few days apart from one another, but that reporting or record keeping on the 2 cases was shoddy. It wouldn't be the first time that's happened, or Herb had an accomplice. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let's move along. Daniel Thomas was the first known victim of 1994, followed by Stephen Spurline Hale. By now, police were starting to put the pieces together that there was a serial killer out there. But don't go thinking they were overworking themselves with this case. Their inquiries were just that, inquiries. When Alan Wayne Broussard went missing in June, police weren't lifting a finger with his case at all. So his mother called a retired detective turned private eye, Virgil Vandergriff, for help. Vandergriff barely got to looking into the case when another mother called him looking for her son, whom police weren't too interested in finding. Roger Allen Goodlett was also gay, went missing during a night out on the town, and Vandergriff was horrified to discover that they weren't even close to the only two gay men who'd vanished off the face of the earth. There was, however, one detective left in the police department who had her morals in the right place, and that was Mary Wilson. She'd been seeing the pattern and following up on it for the past 2 years. When Vandergriff reached out for information, they kind of teamed up and hit the pavement looking for witnesses. They hung posters of the missing men outside and inside every bar and park frequented by the gay community. Wilson and Vandergriff were the ones to make the city aware that it wasn't safe to go out alone, and they were the ones to encourage tips to come in. According to friends, a few of the missing men were all in the company of a tall, skinny man who went by the name Brian Smart. He was well-dressed, drove a dark station wagon, and looked to be well off. A man by the name of Tony Harris contacted the tip line, telling Wilson and Vandergriff that he'd gone home with a man that matched their description and that this man tried to strangle him to death with a pool hose. Tony's attacker went by the name Brian Smart, and he lived out on a private acreage that had a mansion on it. All that Harris could recall was that the place's name was on a board in front of the driveway and that the name had the word farm in it. Since they only had a vague direction from Harris to go off of, Wilson and Vandergriff listed any privately owned land that had the word farm in their name. Michael Frederick Keene and Jerry Williams Connor disappeared in late 1995, and Julie was once again becoming concerned with her husband. His waking and sleeping times were all turned around. He went through bouts of silence where he wouldn't speak to anyone for days, only to emerge with a terrible temper that lost him a fair amount of employees. The chain was making money, but Herb's bookkeeping was so abysmal that they started losing income because he wasn't keeping track of anything anymore. To top it all off, Herb's own son discovered a human skull in the woods that December. Herb wrote it off as one of the cadavers that his father sometimes studied. Julie inexplicably believed him, even though Herb Sr. was an anesthesiologist who'd have had no reason to examine cadavers. Besides, no doctor would ever discard biological material out in the open anyway. And most damning of all, Herb bought the property after his father had died. So how was Herb Sr. supposed to have gotten there to dump the bones then? Just as Vandergriff and Wilson ID'd the estate, Julie filed for divorce. Not because she was suspicious, but because Herb refused to get help for his strange behavior. Another man came forward with a similar story to Tony Harris's. Mark Goodyear had a license plate number, and he claimed that Baumeister stalked him for months. By Christmas of '95, Herb was fully aware that he was being investigated. His wife was gone. He'd moved out, leaving them at the estate. He'd stopped showing up at his store's locations and holed up at his mother's cabin next to a lake. Police didn't have enough to enforce a search warrant, but they were showing up at his stores, sending helicopters over his property, and generally just made him sweat it out while they searched high and low for more evidence. Herb cracked. He'd lost everything: wife, kids, businesses on the verge of bankruptcy, and now everyone knew he was the prime suspect in a homosexual murder. His reputation and the entire facade that he built his image on were crumbling. It wasn't until the end of 1996 that Julie allowed police to search the property. Up until this point, she was tired of her husband's emotional instability, his mood swings, and his relentless impulsive decisions around their businesses. But she never wavered that police were targeting an innocent man. He'd never been violent in her presence. He never shouted at the children, and to her, Herbie, as mentally ill as he clearly was never a cruel or evil man. She showed them the place where her son had found the skull, and scattered among the moss and grass and branches of the forest were bones, thousands of them. By the time police completed their search, they'd collected 10,000 bones. The bodies had been burned, the bones shattered by heavy objects, and then just scattered out in the open in that patch of forest. Herb made no real effort to hide them at all. Putting the pieces together would take decades. Actually, it's still ongoing right now. Only 9 of the victims have been identified from those fragments, with estimates putting the remaining fragments between 17 and 25 more victims. If you were keeping count, Herb definitely abducted 11 men that we know of, 7 of whom were identified by their bones. That leaves us with 4 known but unidentified victims, and a further 20 or so victims' bones that we have no linking to who they might be. But given how Herb probably hunted before he moved to the mansion and his frequent travels, it's possible that he picked up these men from somewhere outside of the state. The house was just as disturbing as the rest. The indoor pool was surrounded by mannequins like the strangest replication of a cheesy 90s horror movie. Staring from every corner were blank faces, delicately dressed and mindfully posed, almost like Herb wanted them to look alive. One sharp detective pointed out that a vent in the pool house was loose, like someone had unscrewed it in a hurry, and it would be the perfect place to place a hidden camera. Julie confirmed that Herb had hundreds of tapes in a closet in that pool room, but when police looked, all of the tapes and cameras that she claimed had been there were gone. Remember, Herb had months to get rid of evidence. Police made no secret that they were onto him. 3 days after the search began, Herb was pulled over by a traffic officer in Canada. The officer reported seeing a box of VHS tapes on the back seat, but since the driver's license was in order and there was no warrant out for a Herb Baumeister in Canada, the bone collector of Fox Hollow Farm was let go. The next day, he was found in Pinery Provincial Park in Ontario. There was a bullet in his forehead, fired from a .357 Magnum handgun, or so we think, because no gun was found at the scene. He was lying with his feet on a mound of sand that had been piled into a little pyramid, and his arms were outstretched like wings in flight. There were several dead birds around the body, apparently placed there intentionally. Police declared the death as self-inflicted. If you had questions throughout this video about how many holes there are in this story, don't worry, so did I. So let's take it from the top. Almost all of the killings, the I-70 Strangler and the Fox Hollow Farm murders both were committed during the summer months when Julie and the kids were away vacationing. But still, how did she not know? Besides that, her husband never touched her and that she'd never ever seen him naked in their entire marriage. He practically lived out of a creepy pool house, keeping company with mannequins instead of his wife and kids. They found a freaking skull on the property, yet she never thought to have a look around that piece of forest. She never asked about the hundreds of VHS tapes that he displayed in full view. I mean, people, really? There's such a thing as naivete and even a lack of intelligence. But this goes far beyond stupidity, love, and acceptance of small oddities. Then there's Mark Goodyear, the guy who gave police the license plate, the address, and who claimed to have been stalked by Herb for months. But neighbors recognized him, saying that he'd been at the property multiple times to house sit for the Baumeisters. Sightings stretching back years indicated that the two were close for much longer than Goodyear ever admitted to. With an estimated victim count of more than 30, just at Fox Hollow Farm alone, almost everyone can agree that Herb could not have possibly overpowered every single one of them on his own. He was tall, but he wasn't exactly the strongest or the most athletic person in the world. Hell, he looked more like a praying mantis than a human. Are you telling me that 30 whole murders and not one man managed to, at the very least, give him a black eye? Goodyear's a strange dude in the same way that Herb was eccentric. His details are never consistent, the dates don't line up, and he never seems to tell the same story twice. I think Goodyear knows more than he's letting on, and Herb's lawyer agrees with me. Or what about the fact that the gunshot wound that killed him was not indicative of a self-inflicted wound? You're gonna shoot yourself from the side or from under the chin, not execution style. Whoever did it then took the gun with them, as well as the tapes in the back seat, and they arranged the body in a ritualistic fashion. And then there's the abnormally long time that police took to search the property or to issue an arrest warrant. Just long enough for Herb to remove the tapes and cameras and to make it across the border. When he conveniently dies and the tapes that could have shown other accomplices or even unidentified victims' faces had now gone the same way Herb's brains did. Poof. And finally, the cops never ran the I-70's hard print or semen sample against Herb's DNA. Now, why wouldn't they do that? They have a suspect, the perfect suspect, yet they've never bothered to test the DNA. I'm sure that Herb Baumeister is the I-70 Strangler, and we all know he's the murderer that operated on Fox Hollow. The question is whether or not he had accomplices, how much his wife, father, and apparent boyfriend truly knew about his secret activities, and where those tapes went. Whether this is a major conspiracy being covered up or just a strange evil man inflicting horrors onto innocent victims all on his own, who knows? Herb Baumeister's mystery deepens with every new victim that's identified and every new ghost hunting group that goes there to communicate with the victims of Haunted Herb, his hideous mannequins, and the constant bones that are still being uncovered in those woods to this very day. This is a mystery that's solved on paper, but once you dig deeper, you find that the questions were never truly answered at all. See you in the next one, people.